and former Vice Chair of the European Parliament Subcommittee on Human Rights. I have chaired Liberal International British Group since the beginning of this year. We are the British arm of an international umbrella organization of liberal and liberal democrat parties across the globe. We have a large number of African sister parties who join us for international events a few times a year. So it is particularly great to see some of our colleagues from Africa tonight. And really, tonight is very much a timely topic, because we have the COP27 negotiations beginning next week, and there really has been a discussion about whether the African Union and the African Group of Negotiators should discuss how the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources in Africa can work in a way that is fair to everyone. And that is what we're going to look at tonight. We have a very distinguished panel of experts which are joining us tonight. So first of all, I would like, of course, to give a very big thank you to Imad, who is organizing the event tonight, which is fantastic. And then we have, give me just 1 second. I'm just looking at my notes. So, 1 second. I just lost my notes completely, so apologies for that. These things happen. So I presume that you're all familiar with Dr. Imad Ahmed, who is a member of the executive of Liberal International British Group. He's an energy and climate advisor at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. He's also the author of The Political Economy of Hydropower Dependent Nations, a case study on Zambia, which we will hear, I'm sure, more about tonight. It is then my pleasure to introduce the first of our speakers, who is Professor Damaris Kaufman, who is the Director of University College London's Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction, and also Professor in Economics and Finance of the Built Environment. Her research interests span infrastructure and climate change, and she also works on the intersection of economic geography, economic history, and infrastructure economics. And our second speaker later on, Dr. Musilu Oseni, is the Commissioner responsible for planning, research, and strategy at the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, NERC. And I, without further ado, will now pass to Professor Kaufman and very much look forward to your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that very kind introduction. I appreciate it. It's very good to be here. And it's, again, many thanks to Dr. Ahmed for organizing this. It's absolutely brilliant to see a former PhD student put together such an incredible program. And I'm very grateful also to Dr. Oseni for joining us. He too is an alum of the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction, as it was previously known as the Bartlett School of Construction and Project Management. So we're all delighted to be here today, and it is a huge honor. I think it is probably worth giving some context for this. And in some respects, COP27 echoes COP26, when there was a real question of how India would confront questions about transitions and phasing out of fossil fuels and what kind of timetable was realistic. And now we are in a position where in August, it looked as though the African Group of Negotiators would not be raising or discussing the importance of retaining and developing fossil fuels for meeting Africa's energy need. They were prepared to be silent about that because there was a sense that raising it would be too controversial based on last year's experience and would distract from priorities that are more immediately important in Africa, such as securing adequate climate finance and securing agreement about funding for adaptation to climate change, which is becoming ever more pressing as it appears that we will not meet the 1.5C or even necessarily the 2C targets. So with that in mind, it did appear that this would be a rerun, but just a month and a half earlier, the executive director of the International Energy Agency had said that actually African countries developing their natural gas reserves would not contradict global net zero emissions goals and would not make a list of the top 500 issues that would need to be resolved to meet that target. And the question really that we need to think about is how far is that true? Because the discussion now does seem to be back on the agenda. And this question about the role of fossil fuels or the role of less brown or more green fossil fuels, i.e. gas or clean coal as an alternative to brown coal or oil, is something that the world does need to confront. And one of the issues that we need to think about, and this is something that has been very close to Ahmad's work as well, and that is, what does energy transition mean? And how applicable is that terminology for countries which have not yet enjoyed universal electricity access and have not yet industrialized? Is it reasonable to impose the same standards for energy transition on these countries? And in a more immediate sense, if we're concerned, as I hope we all are, about global climate justice, is it actually reasonable for the developed North to ask the South to forego growth, to forego rural electrification, to forego objectives that are very much critical to poverty alleviation in order to meet nationally determined contributions under the framework? And if it's not reasonable, then what steps should we take instead? And how should we think of the energy transition in these countries? And alongside that, there's this question of the historical significance of economic growth for these countries. And, we recognize that the energy sector, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is as a result of climate change further imperiled. Ahmad's work has shown that climate change related events can imperil hydropower, which is normally touted as green electricity, and that when that happens, the alternatives to hydropower, such as a diesel backup generation, is actually dirtier than anything that would be achieved by the use of clean coal or oil and gas. So these trade-offs have to be thought about, and they have to be thought about in a rigorous way. It's also important that, given the introduction of the European Union's climate border adjustment mechanism, to think about what this means for Africa and how it incentivizes decarbonization, and whether it presents opportunities for African industries to leapfrog competitors. In a sense, this is not going to be a duplicate of the Asian economic miracle. This is going to look different. How different will it work? And will the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I have with colleagues criticized quite heavily for producing welfare losses in the global South, the way that it's currently constructed, are there alternatives, or is it the case that this mechanism is an effective tool if it's embraced within a particular policy framework, and can countries in the global South benefit? And again, will industrialization in Africa look different from Asia, and how much of that is determined by the need to decarbonize energy, and at the same time to address persistent problems of poverty alleviation? I think there's some other issues that we need to think about as well, and that is that there's a lot of conversation in Africa about the idea that rural electrification, for example, can be affected by solar PV, or that there are other types of alternative energies that can be helpful on the consumer side. But the basic reality remains that for industrial scale provision of electricity, it is still difficult to see how this can be achieved in most countries in Africa without reliance on fossil fuels. So if we're going to accept that there needs to be continued reliance on fossil fuels, what kind of policy framework can we develop to make sure that these are as least carbon intensive as possible, and to ensure that international trading agreements are constructed in ways that incentivize less dirty options rather than insisting on clean options at a juncture where that is unrealistic for the countries in question. So, with that in mind, that is a kind of background to the issues that we'll be discussing. But I think at this stage, it actually is useful, particularly because we started a little bit late, to turn it over to Musilu Oseni. He is, as you said, the Vice Chairman and Commissioner for Market Competition and Rates at the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, NERC. He was formerly responsible for planning, research, and strategy, where he oversaw the formulation and implementation of the Commission's strategies. Prior to that, he had an appointment prior to this appointment, he was a researcher, postdoctoral researcher at UCL and the Energy Policy Research Group at the University of Cambridge. He's very much committed and passionate about energy access, about the willingness and ability to pay, about pricing, about security of supply, quality of service. He's really dug into the details of demand side management, and his research has been published in top journals like Energy Economics, Energy Policy, and Renewable and Sustainable Energy Reviews. So he is perhaps the person who's best placed to speak about this in the context of Nigeria. And then Ahmad will also provide the Zambian case as a counterexample with some common features and common resonances as well. So in order to make sure that Musi has plenty of time to present, I want to turn it over to him now. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Musiliu. We can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay, sorry, I was.
That's
muted.
okay. It always happens at least once.
Yeah, thank you, Demaris. I think it's nice meeting you again at this time after some time of departure from UCL. Basically, I will speak generally on behalf of Africa, but we just use a case of Nigeria just to buttress my points a little bit. Of course, I will be very brief because I understand that we have a very limited time. And I also understand that Ahmad will be making another presentation. So basically, the title is seen on the screen, which is Just Energy Transition for Africa. Of course, currently, I think debate has gone beyond whether climate change is real or not. It has something that has come to stay and is already well established by majority of opinion. Of course, there is certain opinion here and there as per whether it's still real or not. But generally, it's something that has been proven with some cases of natural disaster here and there. Recently in Nigeria, we have a lot of flooding. It led to a situation whereby in the federal capital in Abuja, the truck moving oil, petroleum to the capital could not pass through to get to the capital, and that led to scarcity of fuel in the capital city. So basically, the presentation, we provide some key facts about Nigeria as a background. You can move to the next slide, Imad. On this slide, you see the population of Nigeria, which is over 200 million, the growth rate of 2.5%, and in terms of the ranking, is more or less ranked as the 7th most populous nation in the world. An household of about 3 million, of which barely roughly over half of them have access to electricity. Of course, reliability is still an issue, and in terms of household size, is ranked 8th in the world. So basically, the peak demand for electricity, of course, we all know the importance of electricity because it's an engine of growth, and it also has significant implication in the comfort level of everybody. So the peak demand is forecast to be around 20,000 megawatts, but unfortunately, we currently have mechanical availability of about 6,000 megawatts, even though the installed capacity is in the range of, for grid connected plants, we're in the range of around 12,000 megawatts. But when you had the off-grid and some sort of big captive generation for industries together, we are in the range of 16,000 megawatts. But all in all, when we are talking about climate change and transition to less carbon or net zero carbon economy, we need to bear in mind the developing countries, especially Africa, where access to electricity is still a problem. How do we ensure that in the means of transitioning to a net zero carbon economy, they have access to electricity, and also we need to bear in mind the impact of this transition on the industrialization of these countries, because it all has a lot of implication on the poverty level, which of course is probably the focal point of the World Bank currently. I think we can move to the next slide, Imad. So basically, this slide talks briefly about the about gas, and I think we also need, as we move or progress in the course of transitioning to net zero carbon economy, we also need to bear in mind the comparative advantage of every country. How do we ensure that we are where it is possible to actually minimize the disruption that rapid transitioning to net carbon zero economy may have on the performance or the progress of those countries. Nigeria has a proven reserve of 206 trillion standard cubic feet of gas, and is currently ranked as the 9th in the world. And when we compare gas with coal, I think gas is considered to be cleaner compared to dirty fuel like coal. And in that case, we also need to bear in mind that if Nigeria, for instance, or some other developing countries have this proven capacity of gas, to what extent can they now make use of it? How is it going to be financed to ensure that at least the transition is smooth? Of course, the next, on the same slide, talks about the electricity or the share of electricity generated in the country, the available generation, and so on, of which the bottom, which I think speaks to some of the issues that currently occupying the discourse or debate space about who actually polluted the air and who is to finance it. Currently, based on the World Development Indicator, we have for Nigeria, the emission per capita stand at 0.57 metric tons of
See, you've gone on mute.
Okay. Sorry, I was automatically muted by the system. I think the network went off. So I was talking about the last button of the screen, where we have the emission data as reported by the World Development Indicator. So basically, I think this speaks to the debate of who actually polluted the air and who should pay for it. When we look at the greenhouse emissions for Nigeria, we have per capita is 0.57 metric tons of oil equivalent, carbon oil equivalent, CO2, 0.57 metric ton of CO2, compared to the world average of 4.47 metric ton. And that compares with the OECD country, the biggest. So basically, the share of Nigerians per capita emissions stands at about 12% of the world average. And also compared to the OECD, is just around 6%. And that has been one of the questions or debates currently ongoing about, okay, who actually polluted the air? Why should the developing nations suffer for what it takes to transition to net zero carbon economy? I think we can move to the next stage, and I believe this probably will dominate the discussion this evening. So my belief, or probably the recommendation, would be, as I said earlier on, that we need to look at the comparative advantage of each country with respect to the transitioning, the fuel availability, and for Nigeria as a case and some other African countries, gas may actually serve as the transition fuel, because when it is considered or compared with some other sources of fuel like coal, it is so very, very manageable or good, is cleaner compared to coal and so on. And already this is what the country has as the natural reserve. So there is also, as we progress to the transition, there is also a question of the current base load, that is what each country currently requires, the electricity base load, and the intermittence of the most cherished clean energy, like all the renewable energy, solar, wind. Of course, Nigeria, we don't have much of wind. We have solar radiation is good, especially in the northern part of the country. But there is the question of the intermittence, and if you are to back it up using storage, how about the cost? There is also a question about the resilience of the grids, the electricity grid in developing countries. For instance, there are issues around how much renewable energy, let's say solar, that can immediately or in the short possible time be integrated into the grid in many of these countries, that whenever there is an intermittence of these particular sources of energy, the grid can still withstand it. So those are the questions that we have to look at as we progress on the transition journey. There is also a question around food security, especially with respect to the nature of renewable energy like solar, the land required to do it versus land for farming, which will definitely be a case in some developing countries. And there is an issue, which is the biggest one, which is the issue of funding itself. Who should fund it, or who has the capacity to fund it? Majority of developing countries now, currently, especially Africa, are facing economic crisis. I read about the president of Ghana yesterday, lamenting about the current economic situation in Ghana. I don't think Nigeria is much different. Recently, the president presented the budget to the National Assembly, where close to or over 50% of what is needed to fund the budget is expected to come from loan from international agencies, like the multilateral agencies like the World Bank. So meanwhile, this transition requires a lot of money. We need to develop, if gas is taken to be our transition fuel, we need to develop the non-associated gas. If gas is, also we need to invest in some sort of solar and wind where possible. And most especially, I think what is often overlooked is the investment that will be required on the grid, that is for the transmission network, in order to ensure that the integration of renewable does not lead to serious problems on the grid. And lastly, the debate that some people have is about who is the polluter and who is the financier. Thank you. I would like to stop here.
Thank you so much, Musiliu. Really, really super interesting contribution. I think we're going to go to Imad first, and then we will take questions from the audience, if that's okay. So Imad, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Irina. Great. I think what I'll do is I'll start off by rounding off on a few issues related to governance of the continued use of fossil fuels. So we heard from Musi that Nigeria's per capita emissions are really they're about a 16th of what the average emissions are for an OECD country. So there's a long way before Nigeria's emissions per capita increase, and there's an issue of climate justice here, where if Nigeria is not able to have some sort of reliable baseload energy, well, this is an issue of injustice. But I think there's a number of questions that arise also about unequal distribution and how do we get around issues of inclusivity, because from previous examples of gas concessions, we've seen that they've failed to benefit the poor, resulting in resource traps and creating environmental damage. And I would say that these are examples that should serve to show how to do it differently. Failures need to be highlighted as African civil society groups are doing. These are priorities that need to be addressed. So we can overcome social and environmental failures with better governance structures. These governance structures should relate to, number one, how proceeds from gas sales are shared with the government. Number two, how the government shares the proceeds with the poorest and most vulnerable segments of society. And number three, safeguards to minimize environmental damage, emissions, and restoration. So that's at a very high level. Going a little bit more deep, to ensure that the government take is fair from the gas concession, governments should negotiate for higher percentages of revenues as opposed to just profits and taxes, because there is plenty of, for want of a better word, accounting fraud. Governments should be negotiating into their production sharing contracts strict definitions of allowable expenses for where they are taking a share of the profits, and allowable expense thresholds reducing over time that can be counted towards calculating what the government's take will be from taxes and profits. And they should also be applying punitive penalties for accounting fraud, both to the private sector concessionaires and also their accounting firms for playing around with these definitions, gaming the intention of the contracts. And they should also be employing accountancy firms capable of reducing the likelihood of fraud that gas concessionaires practice in order to reduce their tax liabilities. To ensure that the African gas is used for African development, be it for delivering on energy security with the generation of low-cost, climate-resilient energy for electricity grids, or for fuel for clean cook stoves, or for delivering food security by being used to produce fertilizer, a portion of the government take should be used to support the establishment of gas refineries and processing. That's also helping develop linkages with industrialization in Africa, because currently there are not really very good linkages between fossil fuel extraction and linkages with the general economy. In terms of governance at the government level, project appraisals should weigh most heavily the economic costs and benefits to the most vulnerable and poorest segments of society, and should also give weight to environmental consideration. So these should inform go, conditional go, or no-go decisions, and where there are conditional go decisions made, adequate mitigation plans need to be put in place to minimize the harm to people and the environment. To help decide what is adequate, these plans need to be made publicly available. They need to be democratically scrutinized, and the planning process should be conducted in consultation with the affected people and with organizations which make social and environmental custodianship their mission. Transparency measures should also be in place to see the flow of proceeds through the government budget, and a portion of those proceeds must be allocated for the benefit of the poorer segments of society, be it in the form of hard and soft infrastructure enabling programs or direct cash transfers. Local or state governments managing the disbursement of these proceeds should be held accountable for wasteful spending in the form of sanctions. We can avoid the resource trap through better economic planning as well. Again, while the while the historic occurrence of Dutch disease can erode the competitiveness of non-oil sectors and non-gas sectors and contribute to slow growth, this is not inevitable. Economic growth is caused by a lot more than exchange rate stability. There's a researcher, her name is Zainab Osman, in her book called Economic Diversification in Nigeria. She highlights how Nigeria has experienced strong economic growth from 2003 to 2015 at a time of an oil boom, driven by non-oil sectors such as banking, ICT, the arts, and entertainment. And today, the oil sector contributes only about 10% of Nigeria's GDP, even though it accounts for more than 90% of exports and 50% of government revenues. Why wouldn't you want an additional revenue stream for the government if you can put in place strong governance structures to ensure transparency and equitable distribution? With a bigger pie, there shouldn't really be more for everyone. So yes, there does need to be support for managing the influx of hard currency from gas sales, so that host countries, so that Nigeria's or Mozambique's or Tanzania's gas sales don't hinder value-adding industries from being priced out of global markets by raising the value of their local currency. But beyond money policy, to promote non-resource sectors, an emphasis does need to be put on increasing the productivity and improving the quality and standards to raise their potential, of non-oil sectors for generating export revenues. By remaining financiers of gas development, OECD nations can ensure that these good governance structures are embedded into contractual obligations. In addition, they can ensure that the best practices are followed to minimize the environmental and climate harm by minimizing methane leakages and also providing the additional financing required for carbon capture use and storage. So that's just some thoughts on how to tackle these other issues that come along with oil and with extracting fossil fuels. I'm now going to move on to the case of Zambia, which is a totally different set of cases. But sorry, one thing that I should do before I move on to Zambia is, let me just stress that Africa's gas resources, exploiting Africa's gas resources for Africa are not going to be a huge problem for climate change. If overnight 48 sub-Saharan African countries tripled their electricity consumption and 100% of that power came from natural gas, the additional contribution to annual global emissions would only be 0.6%. And the IEA executive director, which Damaris mentioned in her introductory remarks, has also said that if we make a list of the top 500 things we need to do to be in line with our climate targets, what we do with Africa's gas does not make that list. It does not make the list of the top 500 things we need to do to be in line with our climate targets. So gas has been a proven, reliable, baseload, cheap energy is fundamental to industrialization, and historically industrialization, because of its linkages and because of the structural transformation it helps develop through upskilling the labor force by achieving economies of scale. Manufacturing has been the route to economic development that we've seen so far in any economy that is not a tax haven. So I'm now going to move to Zambia, the case of Zambia, where the system of provision is it was almost completely dependent on hydropower as of 2014. This is the country that I've done my PhD on, which Damaris was the supervisor for my PhD. It's a country now of almost 20 million people. Its electricity access is about 44%, and 38% of the population has access to grid electricity. So even though most of the World Bank's investments in Zambia up until the 1970s were in power, still only less than a half of the population has access to electricity. And the World Bank's investments were indeed in hydropower. and that is part of the issue that we're seeing now with global warming. They couldn't have forecast the effects of global warming on Zambia's hydropower system in 2015, 2016, and 2019. But in these years, droughts caused by El Nino events rendered low hydropower reservoir levels in Zambia, constraining electricity generation capacity, resulting in unprecedented power outages and costing businesses damaged inventory and equipment, their reputations to their export markets, as well as increased costs from backup generation. We saw a halt in growth in manufacturing value-added growth. After these power outages, the growth was severely curtailed. And for householders privileged enough to have electricity access, since obviously fewer than half of the population does have that access, evidence from our research also suggests that the power outages may have had negative effects on their mental health. So hydropower has been a source of, well, complete dependence on hydropower has seen problems. I'm just going to share my screen now to suggest a way forward for green a green approach to meeting Zambia's grid electricity needs. So my recommendations going forward would be to address technical and non-technical losses. In 2015 and 2016, we saw that almost a fifth of the energy that was generated was lost in distribution and transmission. So first of all, low-hanging fruit before even going into power generation. Address the theft from the grid and also inefficient transmission of electricity. The second intervention that I'd recommend is to ensure that there's maintenance of Zambia's very old hydropower dams in order to improve their capacity utilization, prolong their lifespans, and avoid potential catastrophe, avoid the hydropower dams from breaking. Third, and this is really important to stress, charge a cost recovery tariff, because this is what will incentivize independent power producers to develop new power generation assets and sell to the Zambian power utility. And this will also incentivize Zambia's neighbors in the Southern African power pool to sell Zambia electricity, because if Zambia is unable to keep up with the payment schedules because it's charging a very low tariff, they're not going to see the Zambian power utility as a creditworthy customer, and the Zambian power utility is not going to be able to buy power from other sources. Our research with householders has shown that householders were willing to pay about 10 cents US dollar cents per kilowatt hours, which is approximately what we think would be the cost recovery tariff for most power generation assets. Businesses too would be willing to pay more, particularly those that export. The costs of generating backup electricity from diesel is up to a triple of that cost. So it's very important that cost recovery tariff is charged. And then that leads on to the fourth point as well: pursue power imports, because when you pursue power imports from a climate perspective, that reduces the embedded carbon that you have in the construction of new power generation assets. And it also gives Zambia greater, diversification over its sources of energy, and geographic diversification over climate zones. And fifth, and this is perhaps the most complicated point, adopt a multivariate investment appraisal process for power generation. So when I was looking at the investment appraisal processes for historically for choosing power generation assets, there was only one variable that that financiers were looking at and that the power utility were looking at, and that was the financial cost of generating a kilowatt of energy. And in truth, that's not a very rounded way of considering whether an investment, whether a power generation source of energy is the way to go. It should also take into account the financial impact of, for example, you should be factoring in, first of all, the financial cost of delivering reliable power to end consumers using a given portfolio of power generation assets, rather than just the cost of generating a unit of energy from one technology. So that means you can't just look at the cost of the cost of, for example, 6 cents per kilowatt hour of generating electricity from solar for a few given hours. When we have sun, you need to also consider what the cost is of building extra installed energy capacity when the sun is not shining. Besides the financial cost, you need to also look at the direct costs to nature, the direct costs to humans, and also ultimately the cost to the climate, which in turn is having impacts on the capacity utilization of Zambia's hydropower dams. And to show you, for example, what options of energy Zambia has at its disposal, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about hydropower, because I think this is where you're going to hear stuff that you haven't heard before. These are the sources of energy that are available to Zambia domestically or within the region, within the Southern African power pool. And I'm going to spend most of my time on hydropower, because it needs to be a number of assumptions about hydropower as a green way of producing energy need to be addressed, and as a reliable source of energy need to be addressed. So looking at, for example, the 2018 Intergovernmental Panel, IPCC special report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, it states that there's high confidence that human-induced global warming has resulted in an increase in the frequency and duration of marine heat waves, and that further there is a medium confidence that it has led to an increase in the frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events and increased risk of drought at a global scale. And that has resulted in El Nino events, and El Nino events are what are affecting Zambia, resulting in droughts. So the modeling done that's been published by the IPCC shows that for Southern Africa, temperatures are going to rise faster than the global average, and that at a 1.5 degree temperature rise, there's a robust signal precipitation reduction is found. Areas of the Zambezi Basin in Zambia are going to see reductions in precipitation, and at the 2 degree temperature rise level, precipitation is going to decrease by 10 to 20%. Reductions in stream flow are going to decrease by 5 to 10%. And this ultimately means that hydropower generated from Zambia's Zambezi River Basin hydropower plants, it's no longer going to be a source of the dependable power that it once was. Continued high dependence will inhibit industrial growth so long as there are not other sources of energy to complement it. And that really does point to a need for diversification away from hydropower. Large hydropower is also not the climate-friendly source of power that it's popularly perceived to be. First, there is the embedded carbon that goes into their concrete walls. Second, there's the flooding required to fill their large reservoir lakes, which destroys biodiversity, destroys carbon sinks such as forests and swamps, and their ability to decarbonize has been lost in perpetuity. looking at hydropower dams in Chile, a researcher at MIT found that the material embedded energy and land use change would be 48 times the impact of natural gas plants that would deliver an equivalent amount of energy. That's for hydropower. That's a 48 times difference. In addition to all that embedded carbon in the infrastructure and the loss of the carbon sinks, the reservoirs themselves are a huge source of global warming impacts. They contribute, it's been estimated, to 1.5% of all anthropogenic emissions in the atmosphere. So high are the methane emissions that are associated with some reservoirs that researchers have found that hydropower facilities in Africa have near climate impacts per unit energy generation that are multiple times that of coal-fired power plants. They found that in the case of Kariba Dam in Zambia, the global warming impact can be 8 times greater than coal for the near-term impacts. And the reason for that is it's caused by the submersion of vegetation, and that leads to methane emissions as vegetation rots. It's very much dependent on the soil, the area covered, the volume and the depth of the reservoir, the temperatures. But this all points to hydropower not being a great source of energy if you're looking for green energy in the Zambezi river basin, especially a mega hydropower project. Our own research has also indicated that complete reliance on hydropower increases greenhouse gas emissions by inducing electricity consumers who are experiencing power outages to self-generate electricity using backup diesel generation. And that causes much more global warming impacts than, for example, using natural gas would have. And beyond these factors, you also obviously want to consider the impacts on the adverse impacts on the environment and society. Deforestation kills natural habitats. It has been also linked to an increase in transmission of diseases that are from bats losing their natural habitats to human populations. And it's been associated with global pandemics arising from zoonotic diseases such as Ebola. They also destroy communities, homes, livelihoods, and sacred lands, as they have in Zambia, where 57,000 people were compulsorily displaced for the creation of the Kariba Dam under the colonial British government. So these are all issues to consider with hydropower. Zambia has an abundance of coal, and it would be very easy, and it is very easy for them to develop their coal resources because it's domestically available. Of course, coal is not as natural gas has 60% of the global warming impacts that coal does, if done right, if methane leakages, and this is a big if methane leakages are minimized. And also if you also have carbon capture and usage and storage, that further mitigates the impact of natural gas. Natural gas is not available in Zambia, and so but it is available in Zambia's neighbors of Tanzania and Mozambique. And that's why I think it is important for us to talk about the use of natural gas in Africa, where a third of the discoveries of new gas deposits in the last decade have been on the continent. They're in West Africa. They're in Nigeria and Ghana. They're in East Africa, in Mozambique and Tanzania. They're in Northern Africa, and so a large portion of Africa has access to natural gas if regional power pools are created. To make those power pools work, you really do need cost recovery tariffs, so that there is credible commitment to being able to make good on the payments owed to foreign power utilities. And I think there's also something to be said about increasing collateral with multilateral development agencies and banks and the donor community to make sure that that default doesn't happen on both sides. So with gas-rich countries that start exporting to their neighbors, you don't want them to suddenly cut their gas off to their neighbors, and as you see with Russia and Europe. Nuclear is not really feasible in Zambia because there aren't good enough governance structures or human capital to make it work without endangering the population. Heavy fuel oil and diesel are imported, expensive, and filthy. Biomass also is not great from an environmental perspective or industrial waste. Solar and wind are nice to have if they don't cost much, but ultimately they don't deliver energy when it's required. And until batteries, the cost of batteries, manufacturing batteries, and the process of manufacturing batteries in a sustainable way improves, these two don't really help address Zambia's power crises going forward. So where I will land on this is to say Zambia should have access to natural gas through its trading, through its neighbors on the Southern African Power Pool, in the same way that Nigeria should be enabled to develop its natural gas resources without penalization by the international community, without restrictions imposed by the European Union, for example, with the implementation of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I'll conclude there. I'll hand it over back to Damaris. I think Damaris had some thoughts on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I think it would be very interesting to hear what her thoughts are on how it should be altered to be more productive. Basically, the carbon border adjustment mechanism will impose an import tariff on countries with a higher carbon emissions intensity than what exists in Europe. But the problem is, so I'll hand it over, if I may, to Naris.
Well, I think, I mean, rather than just debating the CBAM, I think because we're running short on time now, we're up almost to 7 o'clock. It might be good to have a more general discussion, because I think that we've kind of exhausted the time we might have spent for a three-way conversation. And there's some interesting questions on the chat. Catherine mentions, do we need to be thinking about different options for different communities? The needs of a capital city are totally different in size and shape from those of rural agrarian communities. This would simplify and reduce the cost of network infrastructure. I think she's talking there about microgrids. I mean, we can certainly talk about the international trading arrangements and the way in which punitive tariffs for carbon intensity and the question of the global value chain is well worth discussing. But I wouldn't mind if this were audience led. So, I mean, do you and Musi want to respond to Catherine's question first about the question of how far electricity grids can solve problems of rural electrification, or are you better off promoting microgrids? And I think because you have been speaking now for some time, let me turn to Dr. Oseni first and ask Musi his feelings about this.
Okay, thank you so much, Damaris. I think, as I rightly said in the course of my presentation, I indeed mentioned the comparative advantage, of which it doesn't apply globally alone. I mean, country to country, but within the locality, within a country, you can actually look at the options. For instance, in Nigeria, we have, at the Commission, we have mini grid regulation, which was developed in collaboration with the GIZ. And I think it has been one of the best in Africa. Then we have the implementation is currently ongoing by the Rural Electrification Agency that is supporting some private investors to invest in mini grid in some rural areas. I quite agree that the solution may not be one size fits all approach. In the CTO, you can talk of where maybe you talk about the industrialization, the level of power that will be required, and the kind of grid infrastructure that will be required. Then in the rural area, because you also need the cost and benefits, even if you are extending network to rural areas, sometimes it's not economical to do so because of the little energy demanded in some rural areas versus the cost of extending network there. So you may actually be better off utilizing the available resources in that rural area to set up a mini grid or microgrid, depending on the level of the energy need and the energy intensity or intensive nature of the area. For instance, in Nigeria, we have the northern part of the country where solar intensity is higher than the southern parts. And I think there's been conversation around utilizing these solar resources in the northern part of the country as much as possible, especially given the current limitation in the transmission network that runs to most of those northern parts of the country. I quite agree that we may actually look at the options available and try to optimize. Thank you.
Thank you. There's some interesting comments on the chat, but I think we'll turn to Irina, who has a question next or a comment. Irina?
Yes, thank you so much to all speakers. Really interesting. And I have to say, I'm not an expert, but I learned quite a lot. My question is the following: given the rather different situations in countries such as Nigeria, which of course is a big energy exporter as well as consumer, and Zambia on the other hand, what can African nations together collectively achieve at COP27 next week?
That's a great question. I think, again, we'll actually, since we've heard from Musi recently, Ahmad, this is your event. Would you like to answer that? And then Musi, and then I'll perhaps come in as well with some thoughts. Go ahead, Ahmad.
That's a great question, Irina. I think there isn't unanimity on how to proceed, whether to raise the issue of gas and the use of gas for a just transition or not. I think the starting point would be to agree that it is, and that this is not an issue that's particular to the countries that are host or to gas resources. It's an issue that pertains to any country that can benefit from those resources through power trading, and that's neither the host the host of that gas resource nor the recipients of that gas-fired power or gas directly should be penalized under the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, insofar as they are achieving their already elucidated development plans per the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they're trying to pursue a path of development through industrialization. Yes, they should be afforded climate finance to cover the gap between the least cost option and the green option in any form where there's an alternative, where there's a greener option available to achieve the ends. But insofar as achieving a reliable, climate resilient electricity grid is concerned, we don't have a green alternative yet, and gas is the least regret source of energy.
Okay, no, that's very helpful, Ahmad. Musi, Dr. Oseni, would you like to answer as well about what you think can be and should be achieved at COP27?
Okay, thank you. And I think Ahmad has really done justice to the question. We just like to hear, as he rightly said, about the transition fuel. I think there should be, I don't know if engagement has actually taken place among the governments or the stakeholders in the African countries to present a common front at the COP27. But I think there is a need for them to be clear about their position with respect to the transition fuel, what they consider as the opportunity for Africa that can be quickly announced in order to achieve the targets. And I also think that there is also a need for them to emphasize the financing options, looking at the available financing, and also maybe from there begin a conversation about the financing framework. Because I personally believe, looking at the current economic challenges in Africa, I don't think the funding is there internally to do so. And I think rising from there and taking from the presentation by Himad, with respect to energy import and exports, I think it's probably the high time the leaders in Africa looked closely about development of the power pools in Africa. I think currently it's probably the only Southern African power pools that is doing relatively well, relatively. We have West African power pool. Not much is really happening, but that's understandable because for you to trade, you probably need to have excess internally. So most of the countries in West Africa are still struggling to meet their own domestic consumption. I don't know, Damaris, if there could be an opportunity for Dr. Afolabi to also make some remarks. He's an expert in the field, and I think he's very passionate about renewable. He has worked with the government of Nigeria to look at the renewable energy space.
Yes, if he's happy to speak, I think that would be great, actually, to hear from him. Can you go ahead, Tom? Tom?
Dr. Afolabi, yeah.
Oh, no, it's not Adebayo.
Yeah, somebody else was. So.
Yeah. Can we hear him? Does he want to speak? I can't quite tell whether he wishes to speak or not. Meanwhile, I think Cletus has a question as well that Imad might want to answer about the power deficit, for instance, in South Africa, and the question of Zambia importing power. Is that particularly realistic?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, so I think we can get around this problem if, so Musi's observed that it's really only the Southern African power pool that is somewhat functional. I think there's incentives to help the East African power pool to become functional. Right now, the problem in East Africa is that almost every country in that power pool, barring South Sudan, has excess electricity, and Kenya, because it's endowed with geothermal power, actually is almost completely renewable energy enabled, and that is climate resilient because geothermal is not affected by climate change. So I think it would be really beneficial for the Southern African power pool to connect with the East African power pool via Tanzania, and meet the power deficits that are seen in Southern Africa, and in particular South Africa. I think there's a case to be made, right? So this Just Energy Transition plan that South Africa's got $8.5 billion of financing for, there's complete opacity around how that's going to be achieved. The investment plan has not been disclosed, but I think the donors should, the donor countries should be pressuring for a lot of that energy to be sourced not from South Africa itself. It doesn't have to be sourced from South Africa itself. Tanzania has a natural gas. Mozambique has natural gas. Kenya has geothermal power, and you then also have a surplus of energy coming from Rwanda and the other Eastern African nations. I think if you see that connection between the two power pools, and you see more Pan-African power trading, you start connecting Northern Africa's solar to West Africa and East Africa, you'll see a lot more diversification between river basins, between solar time zones, and so you bring into play the utility of solar energy as well.
Thank you very much, Ahmad. I think in general, I would also like to take a stab at answering what can or should be achieved at COP27. I think that it is premature to think it would be achieved, but I think one thing that really does need to be brought into focus now is this question in terms of climate justice about the trade-off, because Ahmad's quite right to point out that green finance is absolutely essential. Climate finance is essential for meeting that gap between the green option and the least cost option. But at the same time, it's also critically important to be able to mobilize climate finance to ensure adequate adaptation to climate change in the global south. And one thing that certainly hovered over COP26 is the argument that actually the global south is now suffering from the effects of global warming caused by historical carbon emissions by the global north. Emissions that were emitted decades ago are now immediately affecting the global south. So the question of asking the global south to bear the cost of climate change, and at the same time, because the social cost of carbon in the global south is 20 times what it is in the global north, to ask the global south to bear the costs of adapting to climate change, and at the same time to bear the costs of decarbonization and an energy transition is extremely unfair and extremely punitive. And the question really of what responsibility does the global north have to ensure that there is adequate finance for climate adaptation in the global south, I think is a really critical dialogue to promote, a discourse to promote at COP27. And if that can get into focus, then some of these other questions become a lot easier to address, because it's very clear that for African countries to rely or to shift away from coal or oil or diesel to gas is one thing. It's very different for a country like Germany to decide to rely on gas, and the extent to which it took the Ukrainian conflict to cause European countries to shift away from Russian gas. In that context, their decision to remain reliant upon gas is different from the decision of an African country to switch to gas as a less bad alternative to other fuel that's part of the energy mix. So I think these conversations need to happen, because the use of gas in Africa is not going to cause climate change now. It will cause climate change on a decadal scale, but Africa is already having to contend with other people's use of oil, gas, and coal decades ago. And I don't think that that's adequately clear to the public, or even necessarily baked into the IPCC framework to the extent that it needs to be. And that's not something that's going to be resolved at COP27. But I think particularly because COP27 is being held in Egypt, it should be possible for that conversation to begin to happen, so that people realize the responsibility the global north bears for ensuring just transitions in the global south, and the view that it's not reasonable for India or Africa to be asked to forego development, industrialization, poverty alleviation because of emissions that originated elsewhere. And I think that that's also why, to some extent, the CBAM is so unfortunate, because what it's proposing to do is punish carbon intensity now. It's not taking into account carbon intensity decades ago that have brought us to the place where we are now. So I think these issues should be addressed, but I don't think that they will be resolved by any means. It's just a question of ensuring that this remains part of the conversation as we confront the fact that the social cost of carbon is very high and is growing in cities in the global south, whereas in the north, there is this sense that if everybody just decarbonized on the same timetable, that we'd be able to meet net zero targets. So that is my feeling, but I think I'll stop rambling there and invite others to comment as well. Questions from the floor.
Thank you, Damaris. If I can take one more question, I'm sorry, I'm just conscious of the fact that we're almost 15 minutes over time. But if there is one more question that you want to take, Damaris, from the floor or from the chat, then please do so.
Okay, no, I'm sorry. I thought we were ending at 7:30. I didn't realize we were ending at 7 o'clock.
I am more than happy to stay until 7:30. I find it very, very interesting, but I'm conscious of the fact that it was advertised for 1 hour, so some people may have to go.
Okay. I don't see any other questions. Somebody's asked whether the recording will be shared with the participants. I think that Ahmad would probably be happy to do that. I'd certainly be happy to have my remarks shared.
Yes, that would be fantastic. Imad, do you want to say some closing remarks before we draw to a close?
Sure. No, so I think thank you very much, Irina. Thank you very much, Damaris. Thank you very much, Musi. I think that was a really good discussion. I think Damaris summarized it very well. That it's not that this mess is not of Africa's making. It's not fair for to ask of African countries to curtail their economic development because of the mess caused by privileged countries that have gained have become rich as a result of emitting greenhouse gases. To the extent that there are greener options to pursue, which are not the cheapest options, they should be financing those for Africa's development. They should not be penalizing Africa. I think that's the bottom line message that we want to end on. And thank you very much for everybody who attended. Your contributions were highly appreciated, and we really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you, Imad and Damaris and Musi, for a really inspiring and very, very informative evening. And I hope to see you at the next LIBG event. Good night, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Good night. Bye.
Bye.